Silence was never golden. It only hides the light. Women now raise their voices. A river of voices hear their might. We can hear your voices now. They are written on the pages of time. Women unsilenced. Silence is painful. A voice that is never seen. But your eyes are open. Your voice unsilenced here. We can hear your voices now. They are written on the pages of time. Women unsilenced. Silence is never golden. It only hides the light. Women now raise their voices. A river of voices hear their might. We can hear your voices now. They are written on the pages of time. Women are silenced. Yes, we can hear your voices now. They are written on the pages of time. Women are silenced.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Ashlee, and Alyssa will be doing our PowerPoint slides. Say hello, Alyssa.
That's me.
We will be your MCs for this online event, and we want to welcome you all here. So the song you just heard while everyone was trickling in was written and sung by Jeanette Westbrook. She is a social worker, human rights defender, member of Women Graduates USA, an advocate for U.S. ratification for Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, a co-chair of the Louisville, Kentucky Human Trafficking Task Force, and a survivor. In addition to Jeanette, we have the privilege from hearing from several incredible collaborators. But first, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of the Fraser Valley is situated. So we're formally beginning our presentation with this acknowledgement. And it goes like this. So long before Canada was formed, the Stalo people of the river occupied the land on which UFE is located. They lived in the Fraser Valley and the lower Fraser Canyon of British Columbia, and they spoke Halkomelem, also known as the upriver dialect. We recognize and honor the contribution that Aboriginal people have made and continue to make to our community. We support Indigenous learners and seek to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into the curriculum. So in addition to Stalo territory, we also want to recognize widespread locations from which our guest speakers reside. Speakers, please wave your hands to our audience if you don't mind. So we have a presenter from Kentucky, USA, 2 from Nova Scotia, Canada, 1 from London, England, 2 who work in Vancouver, BC, Canada, 2 from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, 1 who is originally from Nepal but now resides on Coast Salish territory, alongside your 2 MCs, myself and Alyssa.
So now into our topic. So we are here to celebrate International Women's Day with a focus of human trafficking. So a quick history. Over 100 years, women have fought to have equality within society. We see this date back to 1908, when women first marched for equal pay and the right to vote. Shortly after, in 1911, an International Women's Day was honored for the first time in Austria, Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. During World War I, women in Europe officially made March 8th the International Women's Day, and they found their voices holding rallies to campaign against the war to express women's solidarity. Finally, in 1975, it was the first time the United Nations recognized and celebrated International Women's Day on March 8th. Over these years, the world has witnessed a significant change and attitude shift in society's thoughts about women's equality and emancipation. Today, we are pleased to celebrate International Women's Day with a focus on human trafficking. This is a global problem affecting 2 million victims per year. Before commencing with the presentation, we want our audience to be aware of the potential triggering content within. Please feel free to step away at any point if you need to, and we will be discussing and having a question and answer period at the end. So please save your questions and we will answer them. Thank you. And this is just kind of our agenda, what we're going to go over for this presentation.
All right, so without further ado, I am pleased to welcome our first speakers, Jean Sarson and Linda McDonald, the authors of Women Unsilenced.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here, and thanks for being invited. It's an honor to be here. So Jean and I are retired nurses that live in Nova Scotia, and in 1993, we started a small nursing practice one night a week, and ended up in 29 years of being advocates to expose the crime of and human rights violation of non-state torture and the sexualized human trafficking that occurs in that horrible reality. So we're going to share some of our work with you today about that. Next slide, thanks. Next slide. Yeah, great. So it's a raw reality, and it's a Canadian one, not just a global reality. Most people want to think that that human trafficking and torture happen in other countries, but they happen in our country as well. And from Nova Scotia in 2019, we were noted as having the highest per capita of human trafficking in Canada. And in Halifax, our city, capital city, is 7.5 times higher than the national average. And this today, I read an article about the Mi'kmaq neighborhood center in Halifax, where the grandmothers have to shoo away men coming to their doors when they're bringing the girls out. So that's what's going on in our Halifax city right now. What Jean and I have done is we started talking to one woman in Nova Scotia, and that spread to all over. You can see we talked to women in the United States and all over Europe and Israel, South Africa, Papua New Guinea, Australia, New Zealand. And the story is always the same. It's always a tragic reality of mostly parents, not always, but mostly parents or human traffickers or pornographers or buyers in prostitution that torture and traffic little girls and vulnerable captive women. Okay, next slide. So people ask us, well, what is non-state torture? Because that's the crime, and trafficking happens in that. And we have listed here the classic torture, and these are all acts of torture that happen to children and girls and women who have been trafficked: electric shocking, beaten, burned, immobilized torture such as hung and caged, water tortures, suffocation and choking. Of course, sexualized torture and is huge in human trafficking, and chemical drugging, deprivations, forced nakedness, psychological tortures, powerlessness. It's just a horrible list. In the category 2, the one we're mainly talking about today, is where they're trafficked and tortured, and they're tortured in prostitution, as I mentioned, in pornography. And then the third category is social, cultural, traditional, religious based, which is female genital mutilation, child marriage, acid burning, and widow burning. So this is really what non-state torture is, but we're going to focus on the purple circle today. Next slide, please. So people ask us, well, who does the trafficking? Who does the torturing? And in our work, as I say, it's most often families. This is the ones that people forget about the most. They're the most invisible torturer traffickers. But indeed, they're the ones that we write about in our book, Women Unsilenced, Our Refusal to Let Torturer Traffickers Win. And if you look at the community face, they're really big on creating a lovely face for themselves. Then in the family, they'll abuse and torture their children. And in the inner circle, they're involved in organized crime, where they, in an informal network, they will traffic their children to be tortured by people who buy or rent them. And the purchasers know that these children have been groomed to endure torture, and they purchase them for that specific reason. And people say, well, why would they do that? Well, they do it for the pleasure of the dehumanization. Now, the parents will do it for profit, but they also do it for pleasure as well. People don't really want to believe that, but it's true. The parents have great pleasure in torturing and trafficking their children. So their fathers and mothers, their grandmothers and grandfathers, uncles and aunts, guardians, like-minded friends and rings, as I mentioned. They're professionals, politicians, caregivers, fishers, farmers, anyone that you can imagine will torture and traffic their children. And where does this happen? It happens often in the home. They have torture rooms in the basement where they'll bring people in to traffic their children to. They'll take them to other homes, to warehouses, apartments, cottages, cabins, hotels, wherever people gather. That's where the torture and trafficking happens. So it's a patriarchal, misogynistic positional power that grants these mainly men and families to do these horrendous crimes. Next slide. So when we work with the women, they draw and show their voice through drawing at first. And this is Sarah, the first woman that we supported. This drawing is her being trafficked. Her father owned a little store, and he'd sit her on the counter. And the men and some women would come in lines and rent her out, starting at the age of 2. And she said, she can still remember her father say, bring her back when you're done. So she's a Canadian. She's not from another country. This happened in Newfoundland and in Nova Scotia, both. These are other drawings of her being water tortured in the tub, caged and tied up. And this is the basement drawing of her, where her father and mother would bring men and some women to torture her in the basement. So that's trafficking right in the home. And sometimes they use guns, vaginal gun raping to terrify the children. So the guns are used in it and put to the click of her ears as well. Next one. Next, thank you. So this is the questionnaire that Jean and I developed, and women from all over the world fill this out. And Sarah, we have 48 different kinds of torture, the ones that I had listed before in the boxes that I showed you. She X'd off every one of those. She endured all of those forms of torture and the trafficking that she endured for over almost 30 years. Okay, next one. And another hard, raw truth of this is people want to call it assault or aggravated assault, and we're refusing to call the torture and trafficking that they endure assault, because Sarah, in her short 24 years of being, we estimated, she's still alive, but I mean, in the most active time of her being tortured and trafficked, she endured almost 24,000 rapes. That's, she was raped every day. She had oral and anal rape and vaginal rape. And then she had trafficking and prostitution at least 2 times a week. And then there was weapon and objects and vaginal electric shocking, and then bestiality. And on leap year, she was terrified because it was 1 more day. So we won't call this anything but torture. We don't call this assault or abuse. Next slide. And captivity can look very different. I mean, this horse doesn't know that he's bigger than the chair, because he's been trained to stay tied to something. Well, children are trained very young in these families, and they're trained and conditioned, even going to school in the morning. She says she was before she left home, she was ordered to walk and not take the bus. Was given a code name, and a car would pull up at the school, after school and ask her what her name was, and she'd give the code name, and then the car would take her and take her someplace and traffic and torture her. And the father would organize this visible captivity that was going on in front of everyone, and no one really knew exactly how bad it was. Okay, next slide. And this is Lynn. She was a woman that came, I met her as a nurse in home care. And after 25 years of not telling anyone, Lynn disclosed because she was very angry and didn't want to have care. She had MS. And I asked her whatever happened to her to cause her to be so angry. Well, she was groomed by her husband. And then after 6 months of being married, he took her to Ontario with his 3 friends and chained her to a radiator and held her captive for 4.5 years in a windowless room where she was prostituted and trafficked and tortured by the men that came and bought her. And one of the things she said was the most horrific was that policemen would come and torture her in this windowless room. She thought they were coming to save her because they had a police uniform on, but instead they were just like all the other buyers, coming to torture her with their guns and use them as threats as well. So she was gang raped when she first came to the room. She was broken in by her husband and her 3 friends, and she became a piece of meat. That's what she felt she was. And even after 2 years of talking with us, she unfolded all of her story. And in the midst of telling, sorry, that's my timer. In the midst of telling, she had a call late at night telling her to shut up. Now that was 25 years after she had escaped. So it shows how long they keep track of the women. Okay, Jean, thank you very much.
So some more raw truths, and this is Sophie. She was the youngest person that came and asked for support. She was from New York. She was 17. And the reason she came, she said, when she tried to tell the social workers and other people in social work that she was being tortured, they told her she was lying and sent her back. So in telling of her story, she drew this drawing. This was 2005. She was 8 years old, she said, and she and her mother were both trafficked into Prague. And she said what she saw or was witnessing was the threat of a snuff movie being created. So that's why she called it See Nothing, Say Nothing, because no one was listening. Anyway, usually what happens when we work through the internet, people stay and then sometimes they just disappear and we don't hear from them for a long time. And this is what happened with Sophie. She stayed along 2 years and then we didn't hear from her. And then in 2014, which is like 9 years later, we got this message from a supporter of Sophie who said she was doing great, that she was engaged in her life and she wasn't considering killing herself anymore. And she was graduating with a master's degree in nursing. And this is so hopeful to understand with the right care, if we can name the care and know what it is we're doing to help, then such positive things can occur. So this was Sophie. The next slide, please. So this slide is to explain visually what human trafficking can look like on a map of North America. Last year, Linda and I and 3 other women gave a webinar on non-state torture and human trafficking. So I made this map of 5 women talking about human trafficking and what it looks like on the map. So each color represents one woman. The pink is one woman, and you can see she was trafficked in many places in the US and into Mexico. The purple is another woman. Now the little flower-like dots, that represents a woman, but she was not trafficked outside of the state. And for us, Sophie's there from New York to the Czech Republic, and for Linda and I in Nova Scotia, like Linda showed you, so many people from so many countries we hear from. Plus, we did a kitchen table research in Nova Scotia after the first woman came to us. Sarah was her name she chose. and to find out if there was more than one woman in Nova Scotia who was born into a family that tortured and trafficked them. And out of those women, there were 6 women that came, and 4 of them had the same story as Sarah had. So at the top there is an old book I have. It was published in 1910. And in it, there's a story of 100 girls from Canada being trafficked into the USA. And 1/3 of those girls were from Nova Scotia. So it seems Nova Scotia has a long historical history of human trafficking. And the question mark has state actors in there. And the reason I put that there is because the Global Organized Crime Index of 2021 talks about state actors all over the world being part of the resistance, that they're not enforcing the laws, or they're perpetrators, or they're stalling, or they're protecting their peers. So they're using their positional power to not protect women and girls and children. So the next slide, please. So what we learned in our 29 years working supporting women is it's really important that we name that they've been victimized, not just trauma informed, but victimization and traumatization informed. And what we've learned is that women, when we explain to women, well, this is a crime that was committed against you, they said often nobody ever told them that everybody was focused on the trauma that they had. But when they're told they had a crime, it says it releases their blame, their sense of blame, because perpetrators always tell them, you know, it's their fault, this is what they deserve, all the negative verbal tortures that they can think of. So for us, we really do promote the fact to name victimization, traumatization. So what to do? That's one thing you can do, is to remember they've been victimized. There was a crime committed against them. And we don't pathologize their survival responses. We don't call it post-traumatic stress disorder. We say it's post-traumatic stress responses. They don't have a disorder. We can't think that any of us would come out of torture and trafficking, be smiley and not have responses. So that is one thing you can think about doing. The next slide, please. So what else can you do? Fundamentally, if a woman discloses and uses the language of being tortured and trafficked, believe them and tell them you're sorry, and use the word, I hear you that you were tortured and trafficked. This is a reflective statement, and they tell us all the time. It reinforces their sense of humanity, their sense that they've been violated, and they're being heard, they're being respected. And if you take records, please write torture. If they tell you that they were tortured, please do not write abuse or assault, because women see this. And of course, what that feels like, their trust is betrayed. They've shared what happened to them, and then they're not listened to. So it's a very, very simple, but very effective intervention. And the next slide, please. So language is so important. Naming is so important. So this is a little drawing of a person, a woman in this case, talking torture. And the system, the ear, is not hearing torture. It's hearing assault or abuse. So Elizabeth explains in her drawing here, she's walking around with all the torture and human trafficking ordeals in her head. So when she wants to speak, she says, I do speak about torture. Sometimes I feel so isolated, like being in a place and no one talks my language. And I have to keep relating to their language, even though it is not my language. It's social isolation, difficult to describe. So just imagine how powerful it is if you listen and use the same language, and that breaks the social isolation. And for Linda and I, we can relate to Elizabeth, because in 1993, when the first woman came and started disclosing the reality that she was born into, Linda and I had no framework. So we had to create a whole way of thinking and talking and learning. And we were socially isolated because when we started talking about torture, people just thought we were crazy or wouldn't listen to us. So it's really a simple intervention to name truthfully what is happening. The next slide, please. So in Canada, our law does not permit any person, a woman, to go to court and with charges of torture, because our law is written that only people representative of the government can be charged with torture. So that means embassy people, it'd be senators, if you will, police, military. So that's how our law is written. So for us, we see that as discrimination. So Alex, she fled Canada to go to another country because she felt if she stayed in Canada, her torturers would kill her. But she wrote to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights a victim impact statement saying, as a victim, it is so simple. Anyone who has been through or cares about someone who has been through non-state torture would say it is a crime. Unless this crime is named torture, I won't be an actual person. I will always be the dirty object with no rights. And Sarah, who was the first woman that came to us, said, I don't want to die in it. And that's how important the law is. When we say it should be, the law should be centered on the client or those who are being perpetrated against. This is what they're saying. If we don't have that, then they're feeling that they're social isolated and nobody cares. The next slide, please. So very quickly, what can be done? We've already talked about promoting truth-telling. Listen to what you're being told. And that involves being accountable legally in our country. That's why Linda and I keep challenging our government to change the law. And if we change the law, it ends the perpetrator's impunity. It promotes the women or any person's dignity if they've been tortured. And if we don't have a crime named, then the MO of the perpetrators is invisible. So if we have the crime named, we can develop investigative skills because we learn about the MO of the perpetrators. And if we listen to the women, they can teach us how maybe we could develop preventive interventions and protect children in the next generation. So that's the reason we wrote our book, and we share it as a resource for people if you would like to read it, around non-state torture and human trafficking, because there was nothing at all that in 1993 that we could access for support. So it was a lonely journey. So we're hoping that no one else has such a lonely journey. The next slide, please. So we also use the Universal Declaration as a tool. The reason why is it gives evidence to women who were tortured and trafficked. Article 5 says, no one shall be subjected to torture. So in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that's, one would assume every person has that right. But that's not what has happened. As I just explained, the law only criminalizes certain individuals. If you were tortured by your parent or a human trafficker or a pimp or a John, they can't be charged with torture because our law doesn't permit that. So it helps women understand that it was not their fault. They were told so often it was, but it's not. And they can see the evidence there that their human rights have not been upheld. And the next slide, please. So just recapping other things you can do. We've talked about the book that we've written, but the middle one on Every Women Treaty, a global campaign that was suggested by the UN Special Rapporteur in 2012. And people at Harvard University has taken that on. And Linda, we can put some more information in the chat box, or maybe Ashlee will put it in. And the Universal Declaration I've already talked about. So now what we're going to bring in is Elizabeth Gordon and her little video that we made in Geneva at the UN. Elizabeth Gordon is a survivor, an artist, a feminist human rights activist that we've known for 10 years, I think now. So she submitted her drawing and this is what she's saying. Linda made this little video at the UN.
So here I am at the UN in Geneva, Switzerland, at the Beijing +25 review meeting. It's October the 30th, 2019, and I'm standing in front of my artwork, which has been included in an exhibition to go with the review meeting. And I'm honoured, proud, and completely amazed that my artwork has actually been included in an exhibition here, right inside the UN. There are no words to describe it. I'm particularly proud because it's an artwork which reflects my surviving non-state torture through my childhood, and it stands for recognising non-state torture as a human rights violation, and there's a specific form of violence against women and girls, and the text at the bottom underneath the picture reflects that. And here she is walking out of the shadows like many women and girls who've been invisibilised for years and years and years. Their torture harms not known or recognised. So it says, no more invisibilisation on state torture is a crime, a violation of human rights of women and girls.
And congratulations, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
So that's the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And we have questions and comments later.
Hello, everyone. So good to be with you on International Women's Day. My name is Kathleen Quinn. I'm from Edmonton, or Amiskwaci Waskahikan, Treaty 6 territory, and home to people in Métis Zone 4. I'm going to just focus on a little story and just tell you a little story and what are some of the turning points and resources to walk with women from being trafficked to transformed. Next. I want to really begin by, honoring the strength, the courage, and the life force of the children, youth, women, males, non-binary, 2S LGBTQI plus individuals who endure suffering and degradation and who ask for help or who long to be asked if they want help. I was really quite impacted by the presentation from Jean and Linda, and I want to thank them for bringing that before us, because there is torture and degradation. And those of us who have the privilege of walking with people always need to remember to honor the strength and courage, to walk with compassion and understanding. We also need to remember those who did not survive the exploitation and trafficking, and we need to continually advocate for transformation. Next. I think it's always important to remember that in trafficking of people, it's about profit and it is about power. Our expertise is commercial sexual exploitation, so I can't fully speak to labor exploitation or other forms of trafficking. But truly what we have to remember is it is about the money. It is a dynamic. There would be no market if there was no demand for, for the quotes, the product or the commodity. And in trafficking, we are talking about people as the commodity who are being bought and sold and consumed. Next. Our experience has taught us is that there's a continuum of sexual exploitation. And this little chart comes from the experiences of individuals who've been on every point of the continuum and back and forth. But it basically, thinking about a time when a child might be, quotes, trading sex, but that's just for survival or for food, or maybe some of those circumstances that Jean and Linda talked about. It's not a commercialized situation, it's a survival. Others may then, one woman said, well, you know, this was being done to me as a child, and as a teenager, I thought, well, maybe I'm gonna take control and do it myself. So you could say there's a sense of agency. She made a decision to trade sex and to put some money value on that. But what choice did she really have? And then in sex trafficking, it's when the third party, you know, takes over and coerces and controls. What can happen though is if you are in this circumstantial sex trade, you are also very vulnerable to a person abusing his or her power over you and pulling you into the sex trafficking end of the continuum. So that's how we look at sexual exploitation. Next. This is the little story I want to share, and I would like to say that I asked permission for from this young woman to share these elements of her story. And I asked her, what would you like to do for yourself for International Women's Day? And I'd like to offer you a little honoraria for the gift of your story. She said, I would like to go for a pedicure with my mom. So we are going to send them to a really nice spa. We'll pay for childcare, send them in a taxi, because they have come to a turning point of a 2-year journey that started actually around March 13th, 2020, just as the pandemic was setting in. I had the privilege to be the one to, walk with them through much of this, because at that point I was the only one able. We had other advocates, but they were in quarantine, and our whole world was changing right then. Now, their journey began way before 2 years ago, because there was childhood abuse and trauma and betrayal from people who harmed the young woman. And then she grew up trying to make the best she could of the world, but seemed to always fall into unhealthy relationships with men, leading her into different pathways. And at one point, her children were apprehended by children's services. So her whole being came about, I want my children back. How can I get my children back? And that is often the cry of any mother. So this increased her vulnerability. And, with her children being gone, she did slip into drug use and despair, which also increased her vulnerability. Then came a time when she had no income. She wanted to get her children back. And along comes a boyfriend who says, I will help you get your children back. I'm the only one who can take care of you. All you have to do is let me put ads up for you on Leo List. We'll get some money. It'll just be for a short time. And then we'll get that home, and we'll show that you can have your children. So of course, she trusted him. Now, she was trafficked all over central Alberta. This wasn't big city. It was the small towns of Alberta. She did try to escape a number of times, but he was very sophisticated with the use of social media, plus the power that he had over her, this traumatic bond and this promise that I am the one who will help you get your children back. Finally, the situation was so intolerable that she literally walked into a police station and said, I need help. That's what happened 2 years ago. And the police, our human trafficking commercial exploitation unit, kicked into action. They phoned CEASE and said, we need you to find a safe place right away. We're going to focus on the trafficker. So that began the journey in pandemic times. Next. It wasn't a easy journey. We did find that a women's shelter could take her in for a while. And again, they were juggling with all the pandemic stuff. So they said to me, can you keep coming into the shelter? Well, I couldn't go into the shelter, but I could go to the door of the shelter and bring things like books, art supplies, cigarettes, snacks, to help her stay there. And she did for a while, but eventually he found her again through social media, lured her out. He says, remember, I'm the only one. Don't believe what Cease is telling you. And so she returned for a while, and then he pumped her full of drugs, precipitating hospitalization, and she asked for help again. So we were able to move back into supporting her and helping her get to one place outside of the city. And then we worked for a long time to help her get to a 3-month trauma residential treatment. And that seemed to be the critical piece, was being away for 3 months and being in structured residential trauma treatment. So when she came back, she was ready for court. And we've just been through this whole court process. The sentencing was just a month ago. The trafficker did plead guilty, and she was well supported by her mother, by our Cease advocates, and by our law enforcement. Now, what's critical here for Canadians, because we are under a federal review of our law called the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. What's critical here is that he was charged with human trafficking and with procuring, receiving a material benefit, and advertising. The Crown stayed the human trafficking and the advertising charge, and he pled guilty to procuring and receiving a material benefit. Him pleading guilty spared her from having to go through a jury trial. The jury was actually there in place, but because he pled guilty, they were dismissed. And going through a jury trial can be so traumatizing. We were glad. But what's key here is that the 2 charges to which he pled guilty are charges that are part of the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. And this act harmonizes with our human trafficking legislation, because it's very difficult to get a human trafficking conviction. And we have documented that. So I just felt I needed to say that, because we're at that point in history where very few human trafficking charges make it through to conviction. Next. So she is walking forward in hope. And these are ways we're able to walk with her. We ourselves do not have housing, but we know our community partners who do. So she's in 3rd stage affordable housing. She said she wanted to take our Empower You financial literacy and match savings program. And she did, and she graduated. In the meantime, she also then was working with our Building Blocks for Women coordinator, because she still had her dream. She wanted her children returned. And I'm proud and happy to say they are with her now. And when after we were at the final sentencing, I said to her, what do you see now? She says, now I have time to dream. First priority again is be that mom I wanted to be, but I'm going to go back to school someday. So this is a 2-year journey. Not every journey ends. We don't have these turning points every time in 2 years, but I think it can give you a little picture. Next. And I just wanted to wrap up by sharing with you what we call our circle of supports, where we like to say you can enter the circle of Cease anywhere, and we'll connect you to other resources. And if we can't support you at this moment, we know who can, because that's what's key, to build circles of support, many different kind of community resources coming in, honoring the strength and resiliency of the person, and helping them get connected to anyone and everyone who's going to walk with them and support them on their journey. And I think that brings me to the end of my time.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for sharing that.
Is Sai here still? Sai Bar. Let's see if she is available.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay, awesome. So we would like to present a poem from Sai Bar. You can find her spoken word poem for Let's Talk by Sai Bar on all streaming platforms, which I will post in the chat box for you.
Thank you, Ashlee, and thanks for everyone for inviting me and presenting so much insightful information. Thank you so much for sharing that. This poem, as Ashlee said, is called Let's Talk, and I am going to dedicate this poem to all the survivors, anyone in emotional, physical abuse, abusive relationships that have breaking through out of that and found love from themselves and within themselves. So here we go. I'll start the track. Oh, 1 sec. Sorry, technical. You and I, let's sit down and talk about love. Forget about the heartbreaks, the tears, the tough breakup. Let's talk. Let's express our emotions with words that can uplift us, cause what can lift us can shape us and never break us. So let's talk. I remember the first time your smile attracted butterflies to my stomach. But I can never remember the last time we loved. So forgive me if I ever misunderstood your love for roses, diamonds, and pearls, and every teardrop led to another flower in my doorsteps. With another letter written, I miss you. And I'm sorry for hurting you once again. Sorry for allowing love to be nothing more than a concept, no longer a mystery, and your bullshit is so unnecessary. So keep your roses, your diamonds, your pearls, but for now, let's exchange words, cause now I found a new kind of love. The kind of love that I could only find from the one above, and once I found love in God is when I found love in love. So I let it go, fall. Falling from the sky, hoping an angel would catch my heart from falling on the wrong hands. And if you ever run back to me again, I promise I'll shut that door on you again. And if I ever feel lonely and confused again, I promise I will look up to the sky and choose him again. And if I ever want to give up on love again, I promise I will caress and hold my hands. And when I take my last breath and say this again, thank you for this ride, because it led me to me until the day I die.
It's not the place I want to be, but I know I have to be in this journey to heal. I gotta do this on my own. I want to love me first, I guess. So I'm just in this journey alone, and I'm okay. I know I'm gonna be okay. I know things are gonna get better. I know. I have faith.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was beautiful. We will then, to finish off, we will be ending with Dr. Rita Dhungel, who we all wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. So Rita, it's all yours.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you, Ashlee. Hi everyone, this is Rita Dhungel. I am with the School of Social Work and Human Services at the University of the Fraser Valley, and today I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Stolo people. And I'm really, really pleased to be here today with you and sharing some of the knowledge we constructed with trafficking survivors in Nepal. So I'm taking you from local context to international context now. And the topic is, we are doubly victimized, we need justice. I would like to honor the 8 co-researchers who were significantly involved in this knowledge construction process. Without their dedications, commitments, and energy towards this research, I would not be here today and sharing the knowledge with you. So I really want to honor those 8 co-researchers. And at the same time, this is one of the platforms, or this is one of the ways that I can honor the women for their participation in this research and their time and their knowledge they shared with me. Mostly importantly, they trusted me and they share their time. That's why I always find out some of the platforms so I can share their voices through different ways, so they feel like, okay, I'm also my voices are going to be heard, and sharing and providing some education around their experiences. And this is a little map of Nepal. So our research was primarily based in Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. However, as part of knowledge mobilization, we went to different rural areas across Nepal and performed street dramas, and also conducted some interactive sessions with communities at large, including educators, policymakers, and police officers. Next slide, please. Just to start with a little bit background, as we all know now, trafficking in person, human trafficking, is a global social justice issues. Either it's a sex trafficking or trafficking for labor, or even trafficking for removable organs. Mostly this type of trafficking is practiced in India and also in Nepal. In Nepal, approximately 7,000 women and girls are expected to be trafficked annually. And using from preventive approach, there are a number of research focused on human trafficking and exploring the root causes of human trafficking. However, I did not see any knowledge and information around the reintegration of trafficking survivors who experience a number of challenges in their post-trafficking. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to work with trafficking survivors who had been trafficked to brothels in India from Nepal, and now they are back in Nepal in their own communities, or in the capital of in Kathmandu, the capital from Nepal. And this is my honor to collaborate with them and do this participatory action research. We use a wide range of liberatory and advocacy approaches for knowledge construction. We use photo voice, peer interviews, and interviews with stakeholders, providing services to trafficking survivors. And then as part of knowledge mobilization, then we use photo voice exhibitions and media conference, and we also performed street dramas in different places, in schools, and then at the university, and also at the place of the Ministry of Children, Social Welfare and Social Welfare. Next slide, please. This is my favorite diagram. I love this diagram. So the co-researchers, they were also involved in not only in knowledge construction process, but also in knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization. There are 4 key themes we identified as part of the research, and they are gender oppression, systemic enablers of operations, social and religious exclusions, and microaggressive behaviors. Next slide, please. And example 1, gender oppression. You know, I fell in love with a man whom I told later about my history, and I gradually lost his interest. Whenever I asked him to meet me, he pretended that he was busy and later he dumped me without telling anything. If he was a trafficking survivor and I had done the same to him, the society would tell me, "Are you stupid? He's a man." One of the co-researchers narrated this quote. Next slide, please. The second example, as it relates to social and religious exclusion, one of my neighbors had a religious ceremony and unmarried girls from the community were invited to worship at the ceremony. And obviously the girls should be virgin. When I was in a line to be worshipped, they said very rudely that I did not deserve this honor as they did not regard me as an unmarried person because I already lost my virginity by sleeping with several men in India. I was asked to get out of the line and I then came back to home with lots of tears, very offensive. Next slide, please. Example 3, microaggressive behaviors. It was just 2 days ago when I was acting as master of ceremony at the press conference where we were sharing our findings of this research, that a couple of women congratulated me for the wonderful job I did at the event. They said, "You look very smart and intelligent, but not every survivor is like you. You are so different than other survivors. Despite this, we are still surprised how you got trafficked." Next slide, please. Another example about systemic enablers of oppression, deficient criminal justice system. I filed a case 6 months after I came to Kathmandu. But guess what? My case is still running even after 8 years. And I don't want to deal with the court anymore. I do not want to remember my past every single day. The more I want to forget this, the more I remember just because of the crap process. When I read every time their narrations, I get so emotional. So sorry about that. Okay, next slide, please. Next one, thank you. So we used this iceberg as a metaphor for to critically understand whether if trafficking survivors are successfully reintegrated in their post-trafficking or not. And as I said earlier, the co-researchers, the trafficking survivors, they went to interview some of the service providers, including the police officers, lawyers, educators, and then the ministerial level officials. And they claim that the programs and services are developed and implemented from gender equality lenses for the service providers. But at the same time, when we came back and we talked about our own experience, then what we found that, next slide, please. Education. So most of the trafficking survivors were illiterate, or they could hardly read and write Nepali language. But at the same time, when they are back, now they are back in Nepal and they want to go back to school. Some of them want to be a lawyer, some of them want to be a nurse, and they have the capacity, they have the skills, but they don't have access to go for education. Next slide, please. Acceptance. So what I found from our research that out of 8 women, 6 women, they were exiled from their communities, not only from their society and community, but family and their siblings. They didn't even want to talk. They felt same if the women can stay with them in their house. So they felt obliged to leave the house and come to Kathmandu and experience a wide range of intersectional challenges in their post-trafficking. Slide, please. So another hidden piece, marriage. Even though service providers are saying that no, most of the trafficking survivors are married and they are reintegrated, even though marriage is not the only indicator for successful reintegration. And some of the women who are married, they want to have life, they want to have children, they are married, but they are living with fear and anxiety every single day because their parents, their husband and their mother-in-laws and their relatives, they didn't know know about about their past, and they're worried what happens if they found my past and my relationship, my marriage life is not safe and is going to be ending. So they are living with fear. Next slide, please. Another hidden aspect is family violence. For those women who told their families, including their husband and mother-in-laws and father-in-laws, that I was in brothel in India, I was trafficked, but they are experiencing every single day emotional torture, physical torture, sexual torture, and also sometimes it's more like intellectual torture. They can't even produce anything. They can't even think about that, what their life would look like. So this is the situation in real life in Nepal for trafficking survivors in their post-trafficking. Next slide, please. Job employment. So mostly women, they surprisingly, some of the community-based organizations formed by trafficking survivors, and most of the men are playing a lead role in those organizations. Either the survivors are working as a direct practice, or they are obliged to leave the job because their skills, their knowledge, and their experiences are not counted. And some of the women from our research group, actually, they got fired right after our research period for a number of reasons. Next slide, please. Finally, there is a structural violence. As I said earlier, there is a London system at the court, criminal justice system, and also a survivor, a victim has to provide a proof of evidence that they were trafficked at the court. And it's not easy. How could you provide a proof of your vulnerability? So most of the time they lost the case, or they don't want to go to the court because they can't provide the evidence. And at the same time, this is how the women reported when they were going to the court or through this process. And some of the police officers, they also try to give them physical torture, verbal torture, and sexual torture. So this is the situation in the real life. And next slide, please. So at this point, how could we claim that the programs and services are developed and implemented from gender equality lenses? It's not gender equality, it's more gender inequality. And then there is no social justice piece or framework attached to those programs and services. Next slide, please. That's probably the last one. Yes. So at the part of conclusion and implications, women reported that they are doubly victimized because Nepalese society and culture is inherently embedded with the patriarchal paradigms that escalate the vulnerability of women and girls to trafficking and make them doubly victimized. One of the co-researchers narrated, "I want a welcoming and a safe environment that allows me to enjoy my life and free from being doubly victimized and violence and ongoing stigma." The issues of girls and human trafficking and post-trafficking intertwined with multi-layer systems, as we just learned together. So what we need to do, that communities at large, including policymakers, educators, police officers, and service providers, and I would say even the scholars and researchers, they need to come as allies to support the women and work in anti-trafficking movement. At the same time, a community-based study to unpack masculinity and their perceptions around reintegration of trafficking survivors is highly recommended. That's all for me. Next, thank you so much. Thank you and dhanyavad. So now I think we are opening up the floor for questions and answers, right, Ashlee?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
If anyone has anything that they wanted to ask to our presenters, please feel free. You can go ahead and speak if you like.
Hi.
I very much appreciate the job that Linda and Jean presented. It's so very important to understand that trafficking often starts in the home. And I think we need to acknowledge that. As a matter of fact, about 31% of trafficking in the United States is through the family. Thanks.
That was your song, Jeanette. People need to know that was your song.
Yes, my song. And that was my pleasure to write that for Jean and Linda's book launch. Yes, silence can never be golden. And I think that we really need to take the time to listen to survivors. I was thinking about what the criminal justice system is doing, and I, wow, I was thinking about the pilot project, meeting with the survivors 6 months after the police investigators started working with the survivors. And I was thinking, wow, I probably would have been long gone. And I did prosecute perpetrator in 1992, all those years ago, in Kentucky. So there is a way to do this, and there's a way that police can make it more human. Prosecutors, police officers are socialized to be apart from the victim, survivor. And that probably isn't the best course of action, because the victim can help you win your case. And like they say, no victim, no prosecution, no case. So I would say get closer, not further away, and don't pass us on to someone else, but take the time to get to know the victim and to acknowledge that the perpetrators are closer than they know. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeanette.
Good job, guys. You did amazing. It was on a good day that you did it as well. And it was a really hard topic to listen to at times. So good job, you guys being brave to talk about it.
Thank you so much for that.
If there's no questions, I just wanted to say something, I think, just to get, for myself, to get it on the record for me here in this panel, that I don't consider prostitution work. I'm an abolitionist. And I know we have different perspectives, but when we show you the stories of what the women tell us, and we've worked with adult women who say they chose prostitution and then ended up being tortured. I can never conceive it to be work. I don't want a world where we conceive it to be work, especially on International Women's Day, when we want women to be treated equally to men in the world. I don't think we'll ever achieve equality if we believe that the exploitation of women is work. I don't think we'll ever get there. So I just wanted to put that on the record for myself for today. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda.
As a survivor, I concur with Linda. There is no such thing as sex work. It is prostitution, is what it really is. I don't care whether it's in a strip club, in a massage parlor, the nail parlor, your family's basement, wherever, you know, making pornography at home. That is not work. It is not work. Because if it was a real job, you'd have an employer, you would have the parameters of what your job entails. There would be safety precautions, all of that. None of that exists in exploitation, none of it. And they can call it whatever they want to, sex work, but really what they're trying to avoid is saying the word prostitution, which is what it really is.
It's important to hear that from your perspective, to hear the verbiage and to hear sort of what needs to be changed and what needs work. So thank you.
I was just going to share also, I don't know how everyone is feeling, but certainly with Linda and my experience, often we find that in the presentation, if you've never been your feet into the ditch, if you will, of the brutality that our human species can inflict, including from infants onward. Linda and I have found it often takes 2 or 3 days to kind of reframe the reality that you've just heard. So if that happens, women and men tell us that sometimes they have headaches, sometimes they have body aches, sometimes they feel flu-like. So I'm just sharing that with you. If this has been a whole new reality, it's kind of like if you were in a community and you had an earthquake and everything gets turned upside down very quickly. So I'm just sharing that. If you're finding yourself rethinking life in some way, please just take some time with yourself, and it gets better. And certainly it's like the raw truth. Linda and I and all the women that we have connection to, the truth, telling the truth is so important. And that's the whole way the journey will end, if we're willing to see the truth and tell the truth and walk the journey. So thank you, everyone.
I have one more thing. I was thinking about on the slide where Elizabeth Gordon, who's with us today. Hi, Liz. Okay. She's so right about the language that we have to use the correct words, because what we have experienced is torture. And if we're not naming it, what we've experienced, then you aren't hearing us. You aren't acknowledging our experiences. And I think that's really important, because, you know, I had 14 years of therapy and all kinds of groups and all kinds of things. And that being alone, because there was no language, the only language that I found that talked about torture was the language in the Holocaust, what Holocaust survivors, the torture there. Okay, murder, torture, death that I've seen, that fortunately I didn't end up dead. So I think that's really important, and I really appreciate that being part of Jean and Linda's presentation, and Elizabeth bringing that those words to the forefront, because it is lonely when you're not hearing what really you have experienced.
Yeah, that actually stood out to me as well when I saw that. I thought that connection of using the verbiage that is closest to the victim, the person who's been through that. So thank you for sharing that. I see that Kathleen has her hand up as well.
Thank you. I would just like to echo that in Alberta, we now have the alert, that's Alberta Law Enforcement Response Teams. And in the northern, we have the north and the south, they both have human trafficking counter exploitation teams. And we have embedded what our term is safety network coordinator. I know that in Ontario, there are similar police community collaborations, and I think it's a really important development that, you know, that is happening. I'd also just like to say that, you know, in some of the educational part of the work that I've been involved in, I found myself going and reading the human rights, the charter, and pulling out the relevant sections that relate to sexual exploitation. And when I talk to women who are considering going into massage and escorting, I do talk about the, you know, that we have a right not to be tortured, and, you know, to pull those out and to say, it's important that our world community puts out a vision for how we are to be in the world, And the charter can then enable countries to hold other countries to accountability. Similarly with the Palermo Protocol, to really read that. And I find myself quoting Article 9 and especially Section 5, but it lines out what Canada signed on to this protocol. We have, as a signatory, we are committed as a country to taking action on all elements of the protocol. So to then be able to say to our elected leaders, what are we really doing to uphold this section or that section? So I might just differ respectfully with our colleagues from VPD. I'm very proud that it was formerly our Edmonton Police Service and now it's Alert. I am very proud that they are conducting stings against men who are attempting to solicit sexual services, who are unknowingly participating in the exploitation and trafficking of individuals. And our organization facilitates the sex trade offender program. We just spent a Saturday with 19 men. And I will say at the end of the day, the men are saying, thanks for the wake-up call. I never knew this was happening. I did not know, the world of trafficking. I did not know, even when women say they are willing participants, I did not know the extent of the impact on their lives. So I feel that actually Canada as a signatory to the Palermo Protocol must invite our law enforcement across the country to participate in decreasing the demand that fosters the exploitation, especially of women and children. That's what we signed on to. Let's do it. So there's my little speech for International Women's Day.
Hi, I have a couple questions, and I'm sorry I couldn't find the little yellow hand to raise. First off, will everybody's slides be available to be able to look at a little bit slower is the first question. The next one is, and this kind of goes back and weaves through several people's slide presentations. Has anybody had the opportunity to consider that a lot of these survivors, which I am also one, may be also dealing with TBI, traumatic brain injury, and the movement towards, in the most unfortunate of cases, through law enforcement, that when an individual who has been so badly violated and passes away from that violation of a lifetime of abuse, of whether or not they can see about if there's a family to get permission from. There are experts now looking at the brains of athletes and other people who've had traumatic brain injuries, which affects their ability to communicate accurately, and often is a long-term condition of the trauma and abuse. And the next follow-up to that is, and what do you suggest when mandatory reporters, sadly, have been and are involved in the human trafficking and abuse of victims? What do you suggest to victims to help? Sorry for the multiple layered questions. And I'll let people answer as they can.
As far as the slides, what we can do is we can see if people are comfortable sharing those after this. We do have a recording of the actual event, but we'll go through just to make sure nothing private has popped up. But yeah, if everyone wants to put their email in the chat and we can get permissions first before sharing anything. And if that is available, then we can forward that.
I can share my email. So I'll put my email in the chat and you guys can just email me if you're wanting the slides, and then I can just send it, forward it your way, either the video or the slides. Just send me an email. So I'll plunk that in there now.
That is a much smarter idea. I like that. Thank you. I don't know if
on to our speaker, Miss Mackey. We have to be very careful about looking at, quote, our trauma and brain injuries, okay? Because here's the reason why. You had talked about athletes, etc., those types of brain injuries. when we're talking about torture or psychological injuries or other injuries, they're encoded differently in the brain. There are different parts of the brain where traumas are recorded, and different trauma is recorded differently in the brain. So what I'm really saying is that, you know, if we're made disordered or made the other or made damaged, okay, then if you put that down in documentation and you go forward to the criminal justice system, what kind of justice do you think you're really going to get? You're damaged, your brain damaged, you can't remember anything, blah, 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 blah. And that really does a disservice to survivors, because we focus on the survivors, but let's look at the damaged brains of the perpetrators, you know, before we start focusing in on victims. And for the most part, the perpetrators aren't damaged either. They do it because they can and they like to. And that's the real truth of that. So that's all I wanted to say about that. But we have to be very, very careful about that. I think it's more to the point of what Linda McDonald was saying. What we're talking about here is a response to trauma, okay, that can be misinterpreted as brain damage or some other type of damage, that it's often a dissociative response system. That can be part of it. And so I think Jean Sarsing can say a little bit more about that in her research, but I think we have to be careful.
I can share, like what we said in the slide, that we don't call women's survival responses a disorder. We find that very disrespectful. As to the brain injury, I can share that many women who we've supported come feeling that their brain is damaged or doesn't feel right. But with the right support and the right care, neurogenesis or neuroplasticity can evolve. And for us, the women have healed their brains and they are able to do that. Sarah was the first one. Like we said, there was nothing we could call on to support how we were going to help Sarah. So it was our nursing skills that came in handy. But what we have found is that it was really important to clarify belief systems. And because the perpetrators for the women that we have supported, they were very, very young when the perpetrators impacted on their whole being, including their brain and their mind. And in changing the belief system, meaning if she was called a pile of shit, to learn that she was a person. You know, there's two absolute different pathways there. And with Sarah, she talked about many brain changes, and we talk about that in our book. She sometimes could hear electric shocking snaps in her brain. Sometimes her brain felt watery, and she could feel her belief system shifting in her brain. So I think it's really important that so-called in medical, the diagnosis, often the whole issue of violence, the historical violence or the historical violence that a girl or a woman or a man or a boy suffered, if we don't go to the root of the victimization, I'm not sure from Linda and my experience that we're really understanding what the issues truly are physically in your brain and in your body. So I share that because I know that the torturers do hit women's heads, children's heads, little girls' heads. And with the drugging, we also know in the torture pain from the physical and the sexualized victimization that's occurring, they do pass out. And often the language, if you're truly listening, they'll talk about things going black. So you can have drugging injuries too, but these are healable. That has been our experience. So I share that with you, but I do know I read just recently a whole report, a medical report talking about brain injury and domestic violence. And you have to understand too, the issue of strangulation. Strangulation is a common ordeal that when women have shared with us, and that also can challenge how your brain functions. But here again, we've only had success with supporting the brain and healing, and that often comes through belief in yourself and belief changing how you're willing to stay with the process and give your brain time to heal. That has been our 29 years of experience.
Thank you for sharing that, Jean. It's a lot of great insight.
I just wanted to note as well that we do have a photo voice expedition that is at the University of Fraser Valley Library. And it is a lot of survivors who are sharing their stories and their artworks that were conducted through Dr. Rita's research. So if you are local and in Abbotsford, we encourage you to go check that out and spread the word to all your friends and family. And thank you for coming. We appreciate everybody who came and shared.
Yes, thank you so much. We're so grateful for all the knowledge and perspectives that were shared today. It certainly opens up our own perspectives and something that we can share and look further into.
Thank you, everyone, and have a beautiful evening.
Thank you. And
night or whatever,
and
wherever you are.
and let's hope for peace in the Ukraine, for the women and
Ukraine.
girls in Ukraine, for everyone, but especially the women and girls, because I read today about some of them being raped to death. And
I know.
It's really
horrific. I read that too.
So peace to them.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Good.